Thank you, Professor Walther, for that introduction. And thank you to the Center for Information Technology and Society and for the Department of Communication for co-sponsoring this talk. As Joe mentioned, the work that I'm going to talk to you about today is something rather different. It's also new for me, and some of it will be presented today for the first time. And because it is so different, Joe has suggested that it might be helpful to give a little bit of a retrospective of my research career to explain how it is that I got from being studying linguistics in graduate school to studying video faces of all things. And basically what happened is that there were 5 external events that I would say very much influenced the development, the evolution of my research trajectory. And these were going to grad school at UC Berkeley, the advent of the internet, increases in the mid-90s in bandwidth and channels of internet communication, the first deep fake videos, and the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I can draw lines here. In grad school, I specialized in discourse grammar. I did field research in South India on tense and aspect in oral narrative, something very, very different from what I've been done subsequently. But the internet inspired me to focus on computer-mediated communication, which was all textual at that time. And one of the accomplishments, I guess you could say, or one of the things I developed was a toolkit for analyzing computer-mediated discourse analysis. And in the process of doing that, I became increasingly aware of other multimodal forms of CMC that were becoming more and more popular. And so during the mid-90s and thereafter, and so I started focusing on other kinds of digital mediation, reconceptualizing CMC as inherently multimodal, and focusing in particular on a category of phenomena I call graphicons. This led me in various ways. Then I became interested in what I'm going to call filtered self-representation, initially because graphicons and Animoji, which are on the iPhone, are related in certain ways, but also because deep fake videos started to be put out in the public sphere. And I started to see connections between deep fake videos and other forms of face filters in social media. And then finally, the COVID-19 pandemic really brought a lot of people online using video and especially Zoom. And so then I decided that really I should be looking at video face filters, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So of course, that each of these areas of focus sort of inform the subsequent area in one way or the other. And I'm going to give just a tiny bit more detail, a little bit of retrospective of that evolution, starting with textual CMC. I'm not going to go all the way back to my linguistic work, which is not, I think, not so relevant anymore. So starting with the CMDA toolkit, my goal in creating this set of what I call a toolkit was to provide guidance for people who wanted to analyze textual computer-mediated communication and analyze linguistic and sociolinguistic phenomena like genre characteristics or pragmatics and speech acts or interactivity, turn-taking, social dynamics such as gender lex and power and identity expressions. By providing a set of phenomena that you could study, that you could focus on to look at those issues, and then suggesting some methods, mainly drawing from discourse analysis and rhetoric and linguistics primarily, that you could use to analyze those methods. Well, that was fine, but already by the time I started working on this, the internet was becoming increasingly multimodal. And so for years, I struggled with how to integrate the analysis of multimodal CMC into the CMDA paradigm. And what I ended up doing is deciding that we needed to reconceptualize CMC itself, stop thinking of it as being primarily about text, about email, chat, and so forth, and think of it as being mediated by multiple technologies, of which text is only one. So here we have on the left side, we have your email and your chat and so forth. We have audio mediation, which initially in its purest form was internet telephony in the mid-90s. Then we have video, video conferencing. And of course, video now includes audio, but Skype was one of the first applications to really integrate video and audio. And then to these three, which are sort of more traditional channels of communication, I thought we should add other things like maybe telepresence robots, which is another kind of technology. And then what about graphics? And then there's a question mark. What's the next thing? I think it's probably going to have something to do with artificial intelligence. We're leaving that aside for now. And then the next thing I realized, well, is that there really hasn't been very much research about telepresence robots, for example, or all these forms of graphics. So what I'm going to talk about today is something I call filtered self-representation, which involves audio and video and filters, which are a type of graphics that are dynamic. They move with the face, and they're non-navigable, because I have that distinction there as well. So going back then a step, I realized there wasn't this research, so maybe I should start doing some of this research. So I started focusing on graphics, and I, together with my doctoral student, Ashley Danis, in 2017, coined the term graphicons to refer to graphical icons such as emoji, emoticons, stickers, GIFs, image macros, video clips, and so forth that are used in interactive textual computer-mediated communication. And of these, and I've studied various of these types of graphicons, but of these, emoji are the most common, right? So I've done quite a bit of research about emoji, looking at things like age and gender differences and interpretation of emoji, the language-like properties of emoji sequences, particularly in Chinese contexts, taxonomies. I've created taxonomies of pragmatic functions of emoji. And currently, with a doctoral student in linguistics, Marina Zhukov, here at UCSB, I'm starting to study the toxic uses of emoji. For example, the effect of including things like bombs and guns. And finally, I would also add about emoji, that emoji can also be used to represent the self. So for example, I have been known, I don't know if you can see that, I have been known to use the woman in a wheelchair, in a motor wheelchair emoji in my teaching slides and in presentations to refer to myself. So this then self-representation through an emoji, is taken to a whole new level with the introduction of Animoji. How many people are familiar with Animoji? iPhone users probably at least have seen them, right? So these are basically they're emoji, large-scale Animoji that are animated by the movements of the user's face and head. They're cartoon-like. There's two types. There's Animoji and Memoji, which are customizable that represent humans. So you can see on the bottom there on the left. And these can be used to record and send short video clips on the iPhone. And so in that sense, they're graphicons because they are used together with text, or they can also be used in FaceTime and video conferencing in real time. So I put together a little research group a couple of years ago, and we did some research about Animojis. And one of the things we did was we conducted a quasi-experimental interview study where we had people match a selected group of Animoji with a selected set of interpersonal relationships at different degrees of social distance, and then had them send a short text message using that Animoji to that person. And what we found was that users strongly tend to adapt their vocalizations to match the appearance of the mask that they're using in support of the Proteus effect that was proposed by Yi and Bailenson in 2007. And here's an example of one of these. The one that really produces the effect most strongly is actually the robot Animoji. When people use it, it is almost impossible for them to not talk in a robotic voice. Beep, beep. So this is a very strong effect. Actually, I think this effect wears off after a while, but it's a kind of an initial effect. Some other findings, we looked at female and male early adopters of the technology, found that they display different patterns of adoption. They're used almost exclusively in close interpersonal relationships. A couple of other observations our interviewees made that are, I think, relevant here. First of all, they actually said they liked Memoji a lot better than Animoji, and they particularly want those Memoji to look like themselves. So they would customize them. And they also said, though, that they preferred, rather than Animoji and Memoji, they preferred the overlay type of filter, such as can be found on Snapchat and Instagram, where the user's face is still visible. And so here's an example of a dog overlay filter on Snapchat. And so in that, so I should say before I go there, I talked about some of the Animoji research in a presentation that Joe Walther kindly allowed me to make at CITS in July of 2019. And in that presentation, I showed this slide, which was my attempt at the time to integrate a lot of different self-presentation tools under a single conceptual umbrella, which I called filtered digital self-representation. So you can see I circled Animoji and Snapchat filters are both there, along with a bunch of other things. Although Snapchat has really upped its game considerably since 2019. So you can maybe notice there that for Snapchat, we say the images are not dynamic and they don't have facial motion detection. Well, now they do. They have both of those and much more because they're competing with TikTok, among other things. And one of the things that was interesting to me at that time was the ways in which, let me go back for just a second, the ways in which users already in 2019 had all the tools available that they could create deep fake videos on their own. And deep fake videos were really fascinating to me as I started to learn about them, and were also one of the developments that got me interested in video face filters. So you probably know, everybody heard about deepfake videos, has a little bit of an idea of what they are. The term comes from deep learning plus fake, and this is video, audio, or graphical content that's generated by artificial intelligence technology that represents a person as saying or doing something that they did not, in fact, actually do. The way it works is a program is trained to replace or synthesize faces or speech using artificial neural networks. So here's an example that was circulating publicly of a deep fake of President Obama, former President Obama. This was created by Jordan Peele, who is an African-American comedian who during Obama's term was pretty well known for doing Obama imitations pretty well. And so he is voicing this deep fake. This is Jordan Peele's voice, but Obama's image, and I'll play this for you.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or how about this? Simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit.
So there's deepfakes have tremendous potential for abuse, as you can imagine. They're used in celebrity pornographic videos and revenge porn, fake news, hoaxes, and financial fraud, as well as increasingly in social media. And since 2019, deepfake technology is evolving extremely quickly. And now there are apps that anybody can use. They're very easy to use to create deepfakes. There are two kinds of deepfakes. First, you can deepfake your head onto another body, and videos and GIFs. Like, for example, if you want to put your head on movie stars' faces in film clips, as this one I think will show. This is just an example. Do I have to click on it? And there's no sound. You can just see this young man's head is superimposed on the bodies of actors in different films. And he's now the actor in all of these films. This started in China, by the way, as did many graphical related technologies. And then the second type, which I think is more interesting, is where you can deepfake another head onto your body. And basically, all you need is a photograph of somebody else, and you can basically animate it or act like a puppeteer in making it say and do things. So this example, I don't know if you can hear it, it's a little quiet. Oops, where'd it go? Basically, it's a deep fake of Elon Musk.
Hey guys. I'm Elon Musk. Yes. Looks like I got into the wrong conference Zoom. How are you? I'm nice. Thank you. Amazing. Nice. Nice hair color, by the way. Thank you.
So these apps are very easy to use. Anyone with an iPhone can make deep fakes. I don't even think you need an iPhone. The app is as easy to use as Instagram filters, Tech Magnet proclaimed. And in fact, it is very much like social media filters. And finally, another event that really encouraged my interest in studying video filters was a news story that in China in 2019 that spread over social media via the hashtag female vlogger experiences bug showing her old lady face. And what happened was a woman who was pretending to be, well, you see on the right, this is what her filter looked like, that she was known as Your Highness Qiao Biluo, renowned for her sweet and healing voice. She was celebrated as a cute goddess by her many male followers who donated her money, by the way, on Douyu, which is the Chinese TikTok, until something happened on July 25th, 2019, which was the technology failed, her mask slipped, she was revealed to be a 58-year-old woman, as you see on the left there, and there was a big scandal about this and a big hue and cry. So this vlogger was using a video filter, not a deep fake, but the public reaction was that it was very deceptive. So I started thinking about the relationships more seriously between deep fakes and social media filters, which brings us finally to social media filters, which are augmented reality overlays. These may be more familiar to many of you than deep fakes. They're very popular on Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, and also on Zoom. And they can visually modify the user's face and or background. So we have silly filters, we have beautification filters. We have filters that can change a user's gender or age. Here's an example.
It's really good. Really, really not good.
So you can see the resemblance to deep fakes, right? And we can even swap two users' faces. You see what happened there. Right. So more than 60 million people use AR effects across Facebook and Instagram every month, according to recent statistics. How about you? Does anyone here use video filters? Okay, does anyone here use Zoom? So, okay, chances are likely that you may actually use a video filter without being aware of it. So you probably know that Zoom has filters that add rabbit ears, and in this case, silly glasses this person is using. This is under backgrounds and filters there. And you may also be aware of the studio effects. People know about studio effects. You can add virtual makeup. Women, you don't have to bother with lipstick anymore for your Zoom meetings. This could be very convenient. Lipstick, eyeshadow. Men, you can add facial hair if you want to do that. What fewer people are aware of, at least I was not until a student pointed it out to me, is that if you go under the video settings, that there is something called Touch Up My Appearance. How many people have seen this? Right. Well, when you went and looked at it, was it already set to something on the slider? Mine was set actually probably a little more than this, probably about 1/3. So in fact, my face had been being enhanced without me even being aware of it. And so I think this is probably the case for a lot of people. So there are various types of video filters that can be distinguished. As shown here, we have identified 7 types. The Zoom sunglasses filter is an example of the type 4 silly filters. The studio effects are type 2, beauty enhancement, the lipstick, and Zoom's Touch Up My Appearance filter is type 1. So in the research that we've been conducting, we are actually consolidating these 7 types into 3 basic types. If I can get my thing to click here. There we go. Which the first type, which is sort of beauty enhancement, the second type, which we call silly, and the third type, which is changing some sort of essential characteristic like gender, age, or your actual face. Okay, why is filter use important? It can improve, of course, improve your appearance and has been claimed to boost self-confidence. It can facilitate experimentation with identity and just other kinds of experimentation, like trying on different hair colors, for example, to see how you'd look. But it can also exacerbate body dysmorphia when the discrepancy between your beautified self and your actual self is made evident and makes people feel bad about how they really look. There's also a potential for deception, impersonation, fraud, and so forth, as the Chinese vlogger case illustrates. And it can undermine trust in a more general sense, in the sense that people will no longer necessarily trust what they see in video with their own eyes. So I decided a couple of years ago to embark on a new area of research looking at these video face filters. It's actually a multi-stage project, and the first stage, I'm going to talk to you about today, involved an exploratory interview study. We wanted to do this because there was really very little research available about these video filters. It's a rather new phenomenon, and we suspected that there were cultural differences, in part because of what we saw in the popular media. And we have a Chinese member of our research team would tell us that, in China, these things have been really big, and for a while, they've been around for a while. So we thought that there would be some cultural differences. So we conducted interviews with video filter users from 5 different cultural backgrounds. So specifically, just under 50 individuals from China, India, South Korea, Spain, and the United States. Their ages ranged from 18 to 38. Although they were mostly college students. 60% female, 35% male, and 5% indicated that they were some other gender. And if you look at the distribution here, you can see that there were not very many Spanish participants. We had the most difficulty finding people to respond, especially we had difficulty getting men to respond to this survey, or to admit to using these filters. And so that's one of the limitations of this work. We conducted semi-structured interviews over Zoom that lasted about 45 to 60 minutes in the winter of 2022, so last year. The interviewers were from the same culture as the participants, except for the Indians. And I lived in India for 2 years, and so I felt comfortable enough understanding the cultural background so that we could interview them as well. We asked them about 45 questions. It was a long protocol about different things, including their use of filters and their different attitudes towards them, how filter use affected their self-concept, filter use in social interaction, and their perception of filter use in other people. And then during the interviews, participants recorded and shared 3 short 15-second filtered videos, some of which I'll show you some examples of. The method of analysis I'm going to show you 3 studies that we've done related to these interviews. The methods of analysis are pretty much thematic content analysis in all of them, with some slight variations. So we started building off the interview questions to get some thematic categories, and then other themes emerged from the participants' responses. We created code books, and in 2 of the studies, then we quantified the distribution of the different themes, taking culture and gender into account. The coding was done first by the interviewer from that same culture, the person who had interviewed them, and then reviewed by all 4 team members. By the way, there's 4 members of the team, 4 doctoral students at Indiana University. And inconsistencies were resolved through discussion. The findings are presented as descriptive statistics because the ends are small. So I'm just going to say up front what some of the limitations are of this research. First of all, it's an exploratory study. It's ongoing research. Some of it is not fully cooked yet. I would say one of the main limitations is that the samples are small for some culture groups and gender unbalanced, particularly for Spain and South Korea. Also, the participants are all video filter users, so the perspectives of non-users are represented only incidentally and indirectly. And then finally, because we interviewed people who are in the United States at the time, almost all the participants are bicultural since they were living in the US. And so this may dilute some of the culture effects, which would be more strong if we had looked at people in their native context. So I'm going to talk about 3 I guess we call thematic focuses, 3 studies that we've done based on the interviews so far. The first one is about filter type and audience. The second is about beauty filters and self. And the third is about filter use and trust, also primarily about beauty filter use. And I'm going to go over these a little bit briefly, but of course be happy to answer any questions about them later on. The first study was about filter type and audience. And the questions that guided this study were like, for example, what type of video filters do people use? With whom do they use them or not use them? For what social purposes do people use video filters? And do the answers vary by culture and gender? And I'll just jump right to one of the main findings of this research, which was that we found fairly strong associations between filter type, which we grouped into 4 categories: beauty filter, silly filters, gender filter, and age filter, and different kinds of audiences, which we classified as public, so shared broadly on their social media accounts; private, shared only with friends, family, and other intimates; and self-only, which turned out to be a fairly important category of people who say they would make these videos and then not share them with anyone. And we found that there were correlations that were significant where beauty filters were more often shared publicly, silly filters were more often shared privately, gender and age filters were more often shared with the self only, although gender filters were also sometimes shared with intimates. So here's some examples of screenshots of the 3 patterns. We have on the left a Chinese woman who uses this filter. She says on her social media, she and her friends all use this filter because it makes them look cute. We have an example of a silly filter here. This is an American male saying he uses this to make his friends laugh with his friends. And then we have on the right an example of a gender swap filter used by a non-binary participant who is biologically female, who claims that they used this filter initially to explore their gender identity, and it was part of what led them to understand it better. So some patterns. So then we decided, okay, we've got these 3 patterns. How robust are they across our sample? So we looked to see, we did a content analysis to see how well these patterns adhered to the different genders and also to the different cultures. So here's the patterns by gender, which show that this pattern is strongest for silly and private, for that association between people using silly filters privately, and it's weakest for the association of age filters used only for the self and beauty used only with public, but still holds overall for a majority of cases. Also, the pattern holds somewhat better for females than for males. When we look at that patterns by culture, we see that overall, given the size of the samples, that the adherence to the patterns is strongest for East Asians, weakest for Indians and Spanish, and the US is somewhat mixed. And then when we drill down to look at some of the associations broken down by gender and culture, it turned out that the most interesting case where we saw really variation across culture and gender was with beauty filters and public usage. So it turns out only Korean men and a smaller number of Indian men adhere to this pattern of using beauty filters in public. That's not to say that they don't use beauty filters, other men don't, but that they don't use it publicly. Okay. So we interpreted these findings drawing on the work of sociologist Erving Goffman on self-presentation strategies in social interaction. And Goffman argued that there are many behaviors that go into self-presentation, including physical appearance, speech register, body language, and other intentional and unintentional social information passed along by actors. And he proposed a dramaturgical metaphor where the front stage is where the people present their public self, where the audience can see the actors and their behavior is shaped by cultural norms, and a backstage, which was a private space where there's no need to perform a dramatized self and where people can relax and, kick off their shoes and be more uninhibited in their behavior. And to this, we thought that you needed to add a third stage, which we call the dressing room. And the dressing room is a private place backstage where social actors can try on different appearances alone before deciding to share them with a larger audience. And I like this quote I got from a site called Organized Interiors, which is basically arguing why you should put a dressing room in your house, a physical dressing room, saying, enjoy the privacy and comfort of a dressing room as you ruminate about your wardrobe options, put on makeup, unwind after a long day, or get dressed. And this seemed like a pretty good fit with these kinds of filters that people are trying on. And in general, this dressing room then metaphor allows for experimentation and self-discovery. So we did find, and this is a sort of a crude attempt here to just gather together all of the cases that we found in our data where people said they only use the filter with themselves. So the first set, the age and gender, are the ones we've already seen. But the ones below are the exceptions. So there were some sub-patterns that we identified where people would use beauty filters by themselves only, or they would use silly filters by themselves only. And what you can notice about this that I think is somewhat interesting, the distribution for the age and gender self-only filter use is exactly proportional to the distribution of the participants in our study according to age and culture. But the distribution of the exceptional uses is strongly skewed towards men. So men are using filters, using them only with themselves. And so this may be part of why we have the impression, a lot of people have the impression that men don't really use these filters as much. They may be using them, but only privately. Also, Indians use them a lot. So other kinds of behaviors associated with filters, people mentioned a lot of social filters that they would undertake with silly video filters. They would share them back and forth with their friends. They would put a filter on to tell a story, for example, to entertain a child. A lot of times people would talk about how they would record filtered videos together, being co-located in physical space. Or they put the camera up to put a filter on and put the camera up to someone else, like a small child or a grandparent, and then show them and make them laugh. Some of the Chinese participants talked about wearing and sharing special filters to commemorate holidays like Chinese New Year's, or an American man said, there were ones for the Super Bowl that you could put on that special day. And there are some that are just games, which is a whole other category that I think people should research. We didn't pay too much attention to them, but here's an example. I don't know if you can see that. A South Korean woman said, this is a seesaw game that I play with my boyfriend, where you jump to score points. And there's a bunch of these that are very popular, especially in South Korea. So main takeaways of this first study, first, different filter types used for self-presentation are associated with distinct audiences and different social activities, leading to the conclusion that it's very important to differentiate among filter types. Second, self-presentation can be just for oneself, allowing for experimentation. And I think what's interesting about this is that people were more likely to only only use the gender and age filters with themselves. They'd be happy to share filters in which they had a gigantic nose, for example, or looked utterly ridiculous and grotesque. So somehow it seems that changing gender and age is riskier, socially riskier, than just grossly distorting one's face, probably because it's clear that the gross distortions are gross distortions and not real. And finally, social activities are mostly with intimates and can revolve around filters themselves, such that the video filters are resources for social interaction. And so I think this research, this particular study, shows that video filter use can cast a new light on the intersection of self-presentation and social interaction. The second study explores the relationship between beauty filters and the self. This work is in its very early stages. The self is often defined by social psychologists as an overarching cognitive and dynamic self-schema, a collection of at least semi-related and highly domain-specific knowledge structures, according to Fisk and Taylor, 1991. The research questions that guided this part of the research. First, how does self-construal affect beauty filter use? This focuses on beauty filters, of course. Second, how does beauty filter use affect self-concept? And do these findings vary by culture and gender? Primarily, the findings here are about culture. I'm just say that. So there were a whole bunch of questions that we asked that pertain to beauty filters or were interpreted by our participants as being about beauty filters. For example, we asked, do you use beauty filters? How do they make you feel? Does filter use make you feel more authentic, more like your true self? Does filter use ever make you feel fake? Do you ever use a filter that makes you look very different from your original self? Overall, does filter use have a more positive or negative effect on how you feel about yourself? And finally, what percentage of social media users use filters to enhance their appearance? So people really interpreted most of these questions as being about beauty filters. So in terms of perceived beauty filter use, more than half of all of our participants said that, they said that more than half of people on social media are using these beauty filters to enhance their appearance. The estimates varied widely, varying depending on the platform that people had in mind. So some people would say for Zoom, 5 to 10%. But of course, if people are using the enhance your appearance feature, it's probably a lot more than that for Zoom. To 100% for TikTok. And there's some variation across cultures. As you can see here, South Koreans estimated that more people use filters than Americans, for example. And so there's variations also by culture and by gender. So a South Korean woman, by the way, the numbers here do not refer to age, they refer to the participant number. South Korean woman number 6 said in the United States, 25% of people use filters to look better. In Korea, over 80% is my guess. A Chinese woman said maybe 80% of Chinese people on social media, especially WeChat. It really depends on what kind of video or photo you're posting. If it's for beauty, of course, 100% are using filters. And then people commented also about gender distribution. A US male said, I'd say specifically women. I don't think men are, not to say that men aren't insecure about how they look, but I guess more so women care about the way they look. I sort of carefully worded that so as not to say that women are insecure, but of course that's kind of an implication there. And then a South Korean female added that in Korea, men to women ratio would be 2 to 8, really, really different. Although we haven't yet conducted a full content analysis of these data, a number of themes are emerging from our repeated close reviewing of the videos and interview transcripts. Many, many respondents, especially women, emphasize that they use beauty filters, but only in a way that preserves their natural look. So they say the enhancement is only subtle, just to make me look a little bit better, but look like myself. And there's a strong stigma, actually, that one senses in these responses against appearing deceptive, that there's some kind of an essential true self, and any changes away from that are potentially inauthentic and deceptive. People talk about self-confidence. Primarily, they ascribe a lack of self-confidence for other people using filters. Sometimes they talk about how filters boost their self-confidence and can make them feel better, especially East Asians say that they use filters to make themselves feel better. Sometimes they say they use them because they're just satisfied with their unfiltered face. They are motivated to gain approval from their peers, but sometimes also from society at large. And a lot of them mention social pressure, and this is an especially important theme for East Asian women. Some of them invoke cultural beauty standards, which are different in China and South Korea. So in China, there's a beauty standard for women to have big eyes, white skin, and very pointy chins, very narrow jaws. I guess because Asians generally have wider faces. So one of the participants commented that I don't like these filters because they make you kind of look like a white person. But I always think, well, they didn't get it from the West because we don't have this ideal of women having pointy jaws. But that's the Chinese cultural ideal that women are supposed to look like. In fact, you might have noticed with the 58-year-old vlogger that her filtered image had a pointed chin. But in Korea, a big influence now is K-pop. And especially this is suggesting now ideals of masculine attractiveness that Korean men are starting to follow. So I'm going to illustrate a couple of these a little bit. These are some of the video filters, clips that people provided where they talk about wanting to appear natural. So the person on the left is Chinese, a woman in the middle is Spanish, and the one on the right is, no, I'm sorry, one of them is Korean. The one, I'm not sure which one is Korean. No, actually.
This filter is called nude something, so I'm pretty sure it's supposed to create a natural-ish look. So that's one of the reasons I like it, because it made me look better, but it still looks like me.
This is my favorite filter. It changed me a little bit, like I look a little prettier, and that's why I look.
Why I like it. She's
I like this filter because it can address some part on my face that I am not very satisfied with, and it can beautify myself a little bit, but not too much.
So that was a very, very common theme. Social pressure to look attractive is another theme that comes up repeatedly, especially for the East Asian participants. Although we do have one quote from a Spanish female. She says, I think also I use beauty filters because of society. I'm not going to lie. Yeah, I guess there's some kind of like societal pressure in a way where, we want to look pretty for other people. Well, that pressure is also present in the United States for women in the US, of course, but it seems to be even stronger in China and Korea. For example, a South Korean woman commented, in Korea and China and Japan or some other Asian countries, society kind of forces people to look good, look better. I think that makes some differences on frequency of using those filters from country to country, forces them. A Chinese woman said, almost feel like I have to show a better version of myself on social media to avoid criticism. So it could be punishment, negative consequences if you don't. So we also ask several questions that can be interpreted in relation to self-concept, such as how does filter use make you feel about yourself overall? Self-concept is a system of beliefs and attitudes that individuals have about themselves. And we have a quote here where I think what this shows is some cultural differences. So people in the US were likely to say, yeah, it's mainly positive. Maybe there's a little bit of negative, but I don't find it that big of a deal. And especially men would say, yeah, but it's not that important. I'm okay. This woman says, I'm okay with the way I use filters that, I don't find it to be perpetuating any alternate meanings or anything. But we have a Chinese woman who has a much more positive view, although the ideal images is far from me, but I really like it. And it can sometimes encourage me when I face some hard times. And if I lack confidence now, when I look back at those videos, sometimes it can give me strength as well. And another East Asian woman said, I feel like I watch them and it helps me heal. So really strongly positive. Then we have a couple of South Korean men who seem to have sort of internalized the self from the filters. So we have one male here who says, the results of the filter reflect a real side of me. This is really me. So I watch the videos many times. I don't know if I'm trying to accept it or just interested in my new look. And another male says, I use this beautified filter as a mirror to check the condition of my face. So now this filter has become the default of what I really look like. And of course, people also can be affected, use it because they're not happy with the way they look. So an Indian man said, I was not happy with my head, the way my head looks like, so I'll try to conceal it using filters. Other negative comments had to do with a discrepancy between the enhanced and the natural appearance. And this was something that some American men were very aware of too, as well as women. So for example, this US male said, I generally think video filters are a good thing. I also recognize the negatives of it, especially stuff like facial acne. A lot of times it results in incorrect beauty standards where, people look a lot better with some filters on. And we had a number of comments like this US woman who said, it almost has a negative effect. I wish I looked a little bit more like the enhanced features. And we can see that in this clip from a
Welcome back to my channel. Today I am wearing this filter. It looks kind of weird, kind of good. Look at this eyelash. This is so good. I wish I had this kind of eyelashes on my face. Bye.
So she's a South Korean, and she's a social media influencer. And then several actually Asian American and Asian women commented about the eyelashes as being something that they felt was sort of inadequate about their natural self. The concept of multiple selves has been used to explain cultural differences, and we think that it helps explain some of the differences that we're finding in our data. According to Marcus and Kitayama, who are some of the leading researchers in this area, East Asians tend to possess multiple context-specific selves that respond to changes in the social environment, and thus that may be inconsistent across different social contexts. Where the idea is that the inconsistencies don't bother them as much as they might Westerners. So we have a couple of quotes here where a South Korean male says, I try to show two sides of me, so I have multiple accounts, one for showing my taste and values and another for showing my professional and career-related things. Chinese female similarly says, when I upload to the WeChat where the audience are mainly Chinese, I may use stronger filter to make my face more perfect, but I will not upload those photos or videos on Facebook because I know that's not me and people will know that's not me and it's not the culture here. So you've got this sort of awareness of multiple selves. So we're still working on the interpretation of these emergent findings, but a concept that seems potentially useful is that of the interdependent self-construal versus independent self-construal, as laid out by Marcus and Kitayama. And according to those authors, people of Western individualistic cultures have independent self-construals, where the person is a bounded, unique, more or less integrated motivational and cognitive universe set contrastively against other such wholes. So this would be American culture. In contrast to people of many non-Western, primarily Asian cultures, who have interdependent self-construals, which feature the person not as separate from the social context, but is more connected and less differentiated from others. And we feel that this concept helps to explain, on the one hand, multiple selves, which also could explain their greater tolerance for inconsistency among East Asians that we observe in this study and also in the third study that I'll mention. That also predicts that there's going to be different cultural understandings of what is authentic or not authentic. And finally, I think it helps to explain why there is greater conformity to social norms and social pressure among East Asians, but also among women, because women are thought to have a more interdependent self-construal compared to men. Now, I mean, the literature, the research suggests that everybody has both an independent and an interdependent self-construal, but that one or the other is more salient in different cultural contexts. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up here. Preliminary takeaways: it's important to consider culture and gender in analyzing beauty filter use. Beauty filter use influences self-concept, and self-concept, particularly self-esteem, influences filter use. So you kind of get this circle that can be a vicious circle or perhaps a virtuous circle. Finally, self-construal may influence attitudes towards and consistency in beauty filter use if we accept this notion of interdependent self and multiple selves. Okay, the last study, let's go through this really quickly. Here we were interested in trust. How does the use of beauty filters affect trust and social interaction with a stranger? And again, are there cultural and gender differences? So we asked a hypothetical question. We said, if you were to meet someone in person whom you previously chatted with exclusively over video online, and you found out that their face looked very different from their videos, how would you feel about them? Why? What would you do? Would you feel differently if it was a potential romantic partner, and why? So one of the findings was that there was really strong gender differences for this in general, that it would be particularly different if it was a potential romantic partner. Men and women responded very differently. Men were much more concerned. If it was women would be slightly concerned, men would be strongly concerned if it was a potential romantic partner. And I think I won't read these quotes, but I'll just tell you what the findings show overall. Overall, women more than men expressed disappointment, compassion, understanding, respect, and speculated about the lack of self-confidence on the part of the video filter user. And more women initially said they would proceed normally. Men, in contrast, attributed dishonesty as the motive more, were more distrustful and expressed indifference and mixed judgments more than women did. The patterns are illustrated in the quotes. I think in the interest of time, I won't read them. So here's just some of the findings. We've published this research last summer. The genders attributed different motivations. The romantic partner responses are always on the right and the initial responses are on the left. Men were much more likely to attribute dishonesty. Women were likely to attribute a lack of self-confidence. Why this other person used those filters. Women were also more likely, everybody was more likely to be judgmental, but women were more likely to express compassion and understanding, even more so if it was a romantic partner for some reason. In terms of actions taken in response, women were much more likely to say they would proceed normally, and then they would ask maybe, why do you use these filters? Although that changed when it was a romantic partner. Everybody was more likely to say they'd cut off contact. And then in terms of trust, women were actually very flat here, that they sort of equally said they trust or not trust to start with. Not very many people mentioned trust, but of those who did. But it didn't change for a romantic partner, whereas for men, they were more likely to say no, they would not trust, and that was especially true in a romantic partner relationship. So, as I say, trust wasn't mentioned very often. Some mentions were only because the interviewer asked them explicitly. Like in this first example, I think it would make me sad, this US woman says, because I would just be like, why do they want to look so completely different than they do in real life? And the interviewer said, would you trust that person less? And they say, maybe a little bit, but not really. We were like, okay. The most negative comments were from Indians. For example, this Indian woman who said, I definitely feel deceived, especially if it was like a romantic relationship. I would feel completely deceived by them for trying to portray something they are not. And I might not go forward with it, not because of how they look, but because they weren't comfortable showing their true selves. So even when they express strong negative reactions, they don't go so far as to say that they would actually distrust this hypothetical person. There's still that sort of trying to understand them, their motivations. There's somewhat of a culture difference. East Asians are more tolerant and understanding. I will, one woman said, I think it's somewhat cute because they want to look better to impress you. A man says, I'm okay with that. I'm totally cool with it. Chinese person says, yeah, it's totally expected if it's a woman, understandable and expected. So interestingly, research on trust, for example, by Shurman et al., that defines trust as someone's perceptions about an individual's ability, benevolence, and integrity. And these three categories are thought to be undermined by deceptive behaviors, normally leading to a loss of trust. But in our study, perceptions of deception do not lead our participants to distrust in the majority of cases. Rather, they tend to project their own motives based on their own usage and intentions, as for example, this Chinese woman who says, it's interesting and understandable because I'm like that. Actually, it's me and my husband. I was the one using the filters. So, takeaways. Beauty filter use does not strongly affect assessments of untrustworthiness among these young video filter users. They rather may interpret it in naive ways, especially women. Female participants would try to understand and sympathize with the deceptive filter users' motivations in terms of body image and self-esteem. This is consistent with findings that women have more compassion than men towards others. Whereas male participants more often responded with negative judgment and distrust, a couple of guys, but not many, but especially towards potential romantic partners. Only a few interviewees, most of them men, said they would be suspicious of the deceptive filters users more generally. And of course, this could be problematic as video filter scams become more common and awareness of them increases. Okay. So broader implications. In addition to implications for doing research on video filters, such as the importance of taking culture and gender and filter type into account, I think that this research and filter use in general has much broader implications because filter use can shape social outcomes. We all know that there are potential social and economic benefits relating to looking attractive, trustworthy, responsible, compassionate, intelligent, competent, confident, innocent, the list could go on and on, in real world contexts, ranging from elections to sentencing in criminal courts, right? People now have these tools that would enable them to make subtle modifications to manipulate the outcomes of their interactions with others online. For example, through mobile apps, such as ones that are widely available in East Asia, such as the Meitu app or Snow in Korea, that allow people to make very subtle modifications. And if those modifications are subtle enough that other people don't really notice them, and if everyone starts using them, like everybody is using now Zoom enhancements probably, then their use is going to spread, which is something to be aware of, right, when people are using these manipulations. So especially in the case of neutral facial images, people have found that there are certain perceptions, which are actually stereotypes, about facial features that map onto personality traits. So here's an original picture of me that I took late at night a couple nights ago. And I used the Meitu app to modify it. So this is using a virtual makeup only. This is actually the way I see myself on Zoom. So, you know, if I use Zoom as my mirror, this is how I think I look. I am so deceived. And here, so you can, I was trying to approximate a little bit what the Chinese standard for beauty is with the narrow jaw. I didn't quite go so far, in big eyes. So you can modify the bone structure. I shortened my forehead. I did a bunch of things there. But you can also modify personality traits that are associated with personality. Like here's some untrustworthy features: small beady eyes, close set eyes, you know, arched brows, slightly downturned mouth, slight larger space between the nose and the upper lip. Did you know that's called the philtrum? Is associated with untrustworthy appearance. Well, there's features also that are associated with intelligent faces, higher foreheads, you probably heard that one, but also bigger noses and more prominent chins, which, you know, our noses do tend to grow as we get older. So we can feel satisfied knowing that the older we get, the smarter we're going to look. And finally, trustworthy faces, big eyes, slightly downturned eyes, upturned mouth, and so forth. And I think that any one of these, if you didn't know me and you just met me over video chat, I think any one of these would pass as an actual real human being, right? I tried to exaggerate a little bit so we could see the differences, and it could be done much more subtly if you wanted to. And so when might this be useful? Well, maybe not so useful for me at this stage of my life, but for a younger person trying to achieve certain social outcomes, you might want to think about using these apps. So for example, what if you wanted to request donations, as many young people are doing online now? Right now, my research team at Indiana University is conducting an online survey experiment where we've modified the appearance of a male and a female actor using video filters to make them look attractive, trustworthy, and untrustworthy. And we're looking at the effect that those modifications are going to have on the effectiveness of the donation request, whether people will say that they would donate, how much they would donate, and how they perceive the authenticity of those actors. So where I see this going in the future now is that norms of filter use are clearly emerging, and they're emerging fast. So there's growing acceptance and tolerance of filter use, which is going to lead, I believe, to more expectations of use and even greater social pressure to use them. If everybody's beautiful, then we all have to sort of keep up, right? More people will use filters to enhance their appearance online in the future, but also more sophisticated filters will be developed that will enable further modifications, and that these too will eventually become normalized. So this is really, the standards could really get ratcheted up. Women and girls are likely to experience the most negative consequences of beauty filter use, consistent with negative effects of advertising and media on self-image and self-esteem. And I also believe that social media filters and deepfake apps will converge and become functionally indistinguishable in the future. So there's much scope for filter research. Obviously, we need to interview and survey larger samples, more cultures. Every culture was unique, by the way. We're sort of talking about East-West differences, but in fact, Korea and China are different in many ways. Look at different age groups. People commented, you know, who really uses these filters? Teenagers, they said. So that would be an interesting population to study. Studies of actual filter use and interaction would be really interesting to carry out. I personally want to study deepfake app use and see how people perceive them and respond to them. And there's a need for, I think, much scope for experimental studies to test hypotheses related to some of these initial observations. And so I really encourage you to share your ideas with me. I know there's a lot of expertise in this population, especially in terms of experimental study design. And I'll be around for the next few months, and I would really welcome opportunities to have conversations with you about your ideas. So with that, this is the video filter research team. Leo's in criminal justice, Enrique is in Spanish linguistics, and Meredith is in information science. We are a cross-cultural and a cross-disciplinary research team who's been working on this, and so they deserve a lot of credit as well. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I went over time.
Why don't we take time for a couple of questions? And Dr. Hearn said she is forward to the social hour, and we get more questions. She's back to the question. Any questions, you can take a couple, please.
Hi, I'm thinking for the presentation, it's a lot of very exciting research. I'm really interested in the part about because I come from China, so the video footage was pretty familiar to me. One thing I could have a little, it's more like curious, because I think in China, the social media platform was quite different from the social media platform here. I feel like, especially for WeChat, it's really multitasking. So your colleagues, your classmates, your teachers can all see your friends. So I feel like when I was considering using those video filter, I did cautiously think about who my audience is, and I actually will make some adjustments based on what like targeted audience have in this like platform. But when I share something on Instagram, I was less concerned about it because I know it's just like colleagues here or something like that. Yeah. But I'm wondering if the audience in those social platforms actually can potentially influence the result of something.
Absolutely. In fact, we had a Chinese woman who said the exact same thing that you just said about WeChat, that there's the teachers and the parents and this very wide audience, and that they are very careful about how they present themselves using filters because they're afraid of being judged negatively, and that maybe there's, you know, more judgment in China than there would be in Western platforms. For example, they said they wouldn't put up a sexy filter because they'd be afraid that there would be negative judgment. But yeah, another one said, but yes, Facebook, for example, I would, you know, use different kinds of filters and be less concerned to represent myself in a particular way. So that is completely consistent with what our respondents are saying. So thank you for adding the reinforcing comments there.
One more question, please.
So my question is actually derived from me misreading your first slide. I accidentally read it as self-preservation of face filter. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? And that's actually where I wanted to ask you, where in terms of gender difference and cultural difference, how do you see the sort of like self-preservation of our appearances? Just because, for example, women, when we don't wear makeup, all of a sudden it's like, oh, you look kind of sick, you look kind of gross. Whereas men are allowed to have like growth stages. Asian cultures versus Western cultures. Western cultures tend to be more heterogeneous, where there's a lot of different features and stuff like that. So we don't have this same social expectation that people have to look the same. For example, you might have a preference for being tanner versus paler. Might have certain preferences like freckles versus not. Whereas like in Asian countries, most people are only heterogeneous or homogeneous. Thank you. And so it's sort of like we expect people to look a certain standard.
Mhm. Right, it's that conformity to social norms. Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that you said. I'm not quite sure what you mean by self-preservation. Is it mean, yeah, I mean, could you maybe define what you mean by that?
Oh, yes.
Mhm.
In terms of like self-preservation of like looking good online, like
Mhm.
that's sort of like I must maintain a physical appearance even when I'm quote anonymous and such as that.
Mhm.
Versus like gender differences where like men can be like their raw personas.
Right. Yeah, well, so actually, it's interesting that a number of the East Asians commented on culture differences. And they would say things like, yeah, in Korea, in China, it's really, we have to look a certain way. There's really this strong expectation. Americans don't care how they look. There's this great quote, it's kind of long, I didn't include it, where a South Korean woman says, yeah, in America, people don't care how they look. They just think they're just fine and whatever. And I read that as an American, I was like, oh no, we do care. We do, American women care. I don't know, maybe younger American women don't care as much. Maybe there's been a sea change there, but I know certainly women of my generation, we were raised to be very conscious of women tend to be evaluated more for their looks, and men are evaluated more for other characteristics. And so that is part of the social pressure. But I would be actually really curious to interview a whole bunch of younger American women to see just how strongly they feel that pressure now. Certainly the ones in our study mentioned it less than the East Asians, although some did mention it. Whereas men were like, totally, yeah, we just use them for fun. We use the goofy ones. Mm,
California is very different.
mm.
It's helpful. Texas, yeah.